So now I'm going to talk about the DDAAXX model in international finance or open economy macro. This is an extension of the traditional DDAA model, but it adds a third curve for the current account. The X stands for exports, but we're going to show that that's pretty much the same. So this is going to give us three variables at once and gives us a good model for the open economy that gives us three key variables. All right, so if you're familiar with the DDAA model, and this has two curves, DD and AA. Both of them together, they determine a country's equilibrium output or GDP and exchange rate simultaneously. So D is the goods market and A is the asset market, and where they cross, both markets are in equilibrium. The main goal is to show the impact of various policy, like fiscal or monetary policy, and other things you could work into the model to show what happens to those variables. So, for example, a fiscal stimulus, like a tax cut, should make GDP go up, and it could make the dollar strengthen, and that's kind of what's happened in recent years. This also shows what happens to the current account, and that's on the XX curve. All right, so every point on the XX curve is one possible equilibrium in the current account. It does not have to be a current account of zero. It's just whatever level. It could get larger or smaller. All right, and so you can watch what happens whether the current account grows or shrinks because of the policy. All right, so current account, if you recall, is net exports plus net factor payments, which are in payments and out payments for various companies and so forth. We can assume it to be zero, and it balances out. So exports minus imports are the current account. Now, one really important thing to learn in international finance class are these equations. X is a function of foreign income and what we call the real exchange rate. Okay, M, imports, is a function of home income and the real exchange rate. Now we're going to assume right now that prices aren't changing, and then these just become one or whatever. Just assume that this isn't a factor, in which case we can say that imports and exports are a function of the nominal exchange rate, which we've been working with. Right. In the future, we're going to see that just like you can take a real wage out of a nominal wage over prices, you can divide by prices, but because these are bilateral, you have to divide by both countries' prices. And what happens to make a real variable is it becomes a quantity. And so H cancels out with H. This is on top here, and this is on the bottom. F is here on top, and here it's on the bottom. This turns into a quantity. Okay. The most common example is the Economist's Big Mac Index. Basically, you take $4 in America to buy a Big Mac. You can go to Norway, turn it into enough money to buy like half a Big Mac. Where did the money go? It's because the exchange rate was wrong. It's under or overvalued. Wrong according to its fundamentals. But you would say, well, take one item and turn it into 1.5 items or 0.9 items somewhere else. It's quantity based, right? And you could say maybe it's not just one good, it's baskets of goods, but the idea is the same. Right here, we're just going to say, well, nominal exchange rate, like we've been working with. Okay, so exports are a function of foreign income and the exchange rate. Imports are a function of home income and the exchange rate. As domestic residents have more money, they're going to buy more from abroad. Okay, as foreign residents have more money, they're going to buy more exports from the home country. Okay, and then again, the big part is the depreciation and appreciation. It's up is weaker in this model, so if it goes up or depreciates, a country can export more, the products are cheaper, but at the same time, their money is weaker, so they buy less, and X minus M gets bigger. If E goes down or it appreciates, exports go down. You hurt your country's exports, and you're going to import more because you have more money, and your current account, X minus M, goes down. The negative part gets bigger. Okay, so that's really important to know, and in the model, you just have to remember it to make the model work. Okay, so these are our equations, the functions, and this comes up, but we're going to assume that it's basically equal to E. Okay, so one thing I kind of want to point out here is that if you had X equals M, you would have zero current account. And that's kind of easy to visualize what happens if it gets bigger or smaller. But what can also happen is if CA gets bigger, you could go from a surplus to a bigger surplus. Or you could go from a deficit to a surplus. Or you could go from a big deficit to a little deficit. So it doesn't say anything about whether it's in deficit or surplus. It just gets bigger or smaller. Okay. Same thing for deficit. You could have a big deficit getting bigger. You could have a small deficit getting bigger. You could have a surplus becoming a deficit. Or you could have a big surplus becoming a smaller surplus. All those things are equivalent to a shrinking current account. Okay. Now, in the DD model, we talked about how exchange rates and output levels will balance out in the goods market, and the AA curve is in the asset market. Here, we're going to have an upward sloping XX curve. Okay, basically, if you have a weak currency, you are going to export a lot. Okay, and so E goes up, your exports are going to go up. How can you balance it? You need to import more. Okay, and so how do you import more? You need more income. So a weak currency has to be offset by higher income. So up has to balance up. A strong currency means that you're going to import less. How do you balance that? The only way to have equilibrium is to have less income. So those are both possibilities. We're going to have an upward sloping curve. Okay, but it is flatter than DD because imports are a fraction of output. In other words, an exchange rate change is going to move exports and imports a lot. Right? But you need to move income a lot, but you have to move it even more. You need a big change in income to make the little fraction M move more. So if it's a third of income, you'd have to move income 3 times bigger to move imports once. Okay, so that's why it's flatter. You see that you need a big change in income to offset the small change in the exchange rate. And remember, weakening currency means more imports. Weakening currency is more imports. You need more income to balance, so both curves go up. And we're going to wind up off the curve as well. Okay, so again, we're never going to cross all 3 curves unless you really try. We're going to look at the points that are above or below. Okay, if you are above the XX curve, the exchange rate is weak. And so we've just seen that weak exchange rates mean current account gets bigger, right? A surplus could grow. I call it a surplus here because we just say CA grows or it's bigger than it was. Down here, the exchange rate is small. It could be a bigger deficit. But again, it doesn't have to be always. It could just be smaller than it was, okay? So let's look at some policy. So we are going to look at expansionary fiscal policy, which I've done before without the XX curve, and we're going to see what happens. We know that the exchange rate is going to appreciate from before, and I mentioned it here, but what's going to happen to the current account? Okay, so here's your expansion in fiscal policy, moves the DD to the right. Here's your new crossing point here, all right? But you have a very strong currency now as a result, right? We know the currency is stronger, and as we've seen, the current account is going to get smaller. The deficit grows or the surplus shrinks. We know that exports will fall and imports will rise. And so the end result of the policy, we've already seen that the exchange rate gets stronger and GDP gets bigger, but we can also say you could have a growing deficit. Okay, which is actually what happened in the U.S. after the 2017 tax cuts, right? Deficit grew. All right, and so this third curve, just take the answer you already have, and then you compare where you are. You're below stronger currency, and then you take your knowledge of the current account. Okay, now you could get more elaborate, and you could move the XX. You could do different things and change the current account. But right now, we're just going to say that the current account the deficit has grown and the surplus has shrunk, depending where you started. All right, and so that's our 3 variables together, right? So now we have 3 key macro variables all on one graph. All right, now what about monetary policy? Now I've shown before, we know the end result. The currency is going to depreciate, but what happens to the current account? So now you can say, well, in expansionary monetary policy, GDP should go up and the exchange rate should weaken, but now we can add the current account deficit into the model. And you say, well, the currency is weak, so exports will go up and imports will go down, and so the current account deficit should shrink, or you could have a growing surplus. So in my mind, this just kind of you kind of have to use what you memorized, and it kind of shows you what you memorized. It's a good visual extension of what you did. Maybe it doesn't show crossing point, which is a little bit less than the other curves give you, but I think it's a pretty useful way to have one model that has 3 key variables, right? So it can give you, in addition to just the exchange rate and output, now you can say what happens to this third key variable, right? And again, if I were to do a comprehensive macro class, you could just have this and ASAD together, and you would have the price level as well. And then you would actually have 4 variables, right? And bring an ISLM and you have 5 and so forth. So this is one way to get at variables, but it gets at what I consider of the 6 major variables, and it has 3 of them, and it has both of the key open economy variables. So I tend to use this when I want to explain the international effects of policy. And that's what we did. We added the DD, we took DD and AA, we added the XX curve, and then we showed, in addition to what we've already seen about the exchange rate and output, we were able to show what happens to the current account.